Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Leia Barretts, and I am the Marketing Project Manager at the law offices of Polano & Farrow. Polano & Farrow is a full-service law firm in Rochester, New York, with practices focused on general corporate matters, litigation, labor and employment, and healthcare. Today, we are presenting the cure to your questions about vaccines, a Q&A session on workplace vaccinations, presented by attorneys Patrick Polano, Elizabeth Cordello, and Langston McFadden. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. Our panelists may choose to answer them during the presentation, and we will also have time for remaining questions at the end. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Patrick Polano.
Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to talk about vaccination legal issues, and we're going to be addressing, as this slide illustrates, kind of a little update that I'm going to start with and talk about the vaccination program, a little bit about administration of the vaccines, and then move it over to Beth Cordello from our office, who's going to talk a little bit about mandatory vaccination policies and employee issues, employer issues. And then Langston McFadden is going to conclude with legal considerations regarding vaccines. Everybody's been asking a lot of questions about those issues. So I think those are going to be very helpful to hear. And then, of course, we'll conclude with a question and answer session at the end. So I want to start off with, hold on just one second. So vaccines, we're going to make this PowerPoint presentation, of course, available to all the participants after the program. One of the things that we did, as you can see from this slide, where it says different COVID-19 vaccines at the bottom, these are hyperlinks. So when you receive the PDFs at a later point, you can actually click on this document and that hyperlink, and you should be able to go right to the page. So for example, as you all know, Pfizer and Moderna have the vaccines that are out there currently. There's others that are in phase 3. So if you go to this page right here, you can see, as it notes here, as of December 28th, large-scale phase 3 clinical trials are in progress for the following vaccines: AstraZeneca, Janssen, Novavax. So these hyperlinks are pretty useful to kind of go right from the PowerPoint presentation into kind of the CDC or other links that we have available. If you've been listening to what's been happening federally, this program that we're presenting, pretty much every day it's going to change a little bit, which makes it kind of exciting for us as presenters, because certainly there's a lot of changes from the federal government. And I think that one of the things from even just listening to Dr. Fauci last night, there's going to be some changes. I know the CDC has changed some of its guidance already in the last 24 hours. I've heard that the second doses, second inoculations, it may even be that the recommendation made that you don't have to just wait 21 days. You may actually be able to go a little longer, maybe up to 6 weeks or even longer before you receive the second inoculation. So a lot of different things that are out there. And that's going to make it interesting, but also is going to make it very important that you kind of keep track of how things are changing on a day-to-day basis. In New York, as of the end of last week, 7 million residents were eligible to receive the vaccine. But as you've probably heard, there are some shortage issues with distribution. I think that once the Biden administration starts to work on it, they're obviously going to try to enhance that. And certainly once some of the other vaccines become available, Janssen and some of the other ones, Johnson & Johnson that people have talked about, then there's going to be more supply. And I think that's going to help a little bit. So this second bullet point here says that as of January 19th, in New York, about 79% of sites have administered their first doses and 70% of first and second have been administered. That information is already out of date since I wrote this PowerPoint presentation just a couple of days ago. The governor made an announcement yesterday, and those numbers are up to 93% of first doses and 91% of first and second doses. And I imagine even becoming a little bit more higher numbers already. In fact, I heard Mayor de Blasio from New York City talk last night. Again, the shortage is a big problem. New York City is potentially going to run out of vaccines today or, in the next couple of days. So, very important that that you keep that in mind, that if you are administering vaccines or involved with these sites that are going to be administering vaccines, that you understand that the supply obviously is not as great as the demand at the moment. There's a helpful link here. If you click on this, you will go to a New York State page that determines whether you're eligible. It's very interesting. The government, obviously, New York has started to follow more of federal guidance as to when you can be eligible. But again, keeping in mind, like this illustrates, it could be several weeks before you're actually able to receive a vaccine if you're an individual. So, we do a lot of work here with healthcare facilities, a lot of nursing home work. They've obviously had the first and potentially the second doses already administered. But then everybody else in the community is going to have to wait until the first responders and healthcare workers obviously are at the top of the list. And right now, as far as eligibility, the governor's office has issued a document, and certainly anyone ages 65 or older are eligible, first responders, and it goes through a list of first responders. And so different groups are eligible and will continue to be eligible. But again, without the supply, it's going to be difficult to open that up to different groups. Like this says, there's going to be sites across the state, at pharmacies, at federally qualified health centers, and those sites are starting to open up in a to a larger degree over the last few days, and certainly over the next few weeks. Again, there are so many different guidance documents that are out there and so many different rules. And what I've tried to do is to kind of help by putting them in a kind of an organized fashion. So for example, there's a lot of documents that talk about the vaccination program, talk about what to do if there's an extra dosage in one of the vials, to talk about who gets to administer the vaccines, what rules you need to comply with. If you clicked on this link right here, you will go to a page that kind of has a lot of the New York State guidance documents detailed, which I think hopefully will be a helpful resource for you as you work through your own individual vaccine programs. You deal with your employees. There's going to be a lot of guidance that's going to come out here. And again, as you probably heard, the Governor Cuomo in New York has issued a number of executive orders over the last year, practically at this point, on so many things related to COVID, including vaccines. What he's done, again, there's some information here about who's eligible, like I've mentioned. Some of the vaccination administration issues, again, there's a lot of different sites and places that you can go to. I think that the federal government and the state government have, over the last year, been a little bit, they haven't always been on quite the same page. I think, though, that there's probably a good likelihood now that there's going to be more of a federal response and a federal coordination, that I do think some of the rules from CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the CDC, and New York State, I think there's going to be more of a convergence of opinion and a convergence of agreement on administration and distribution, hopefully more so than has been prevalent over the last few months, so that you won't have to have one federal policy and then worry too much that you're not having a comparable New York State policy. So I do think, if you go to any of these different links, again, this is just more for your knowledge. There are things you can click on, of course, once you get the presentation, just to kind of see a little bit about how the vaccine's working, some recommendations. Certainly, New York has a clinical advisory task force. They're providing a lot of good information with respect to the vaccines. So I think these are all hopefully good resources that you can utilize. And again, the governor's office, the governor has issued a lot of different executive orders regulating the administration of vaccines. What he's done is he's allowed providers that traditionally would not have been able to administer the vaccines to now be permitted to do so, to kind of open up the likelihood that you get vaccinated, because obviously we want to make sure that everybody around the state is able to be reached, even in more rural counties or rural areas. Right now, hospitals have a lot of the vaccine supply, and pharmacies, for example, are administering vaccines to assisted living facilities and nursing homes, for example. But that's going to open up a little bit to allow other sites and other types of providers, of course, to administer those vaccines. So I think that's going to be important. And some of these executive orders that I cited here, they'll obviously allow some of these other practitioners to actually administer the vaccines. The governor was quite concerned too over the last few weeks about making sure that vaccines were actually administered. There's been obviously a lot of publicity about vaccines just kind of sitting in their frozen refrigerators and not necessarily going into people's arms. So he actually issued an executive order about a week or so ago to make sure that all the vaccines that are distributed are actually administered within a week of receipt by a particular facility like a hospital. And if not, he was potentially going to take those vaccines away from those facilities and give them to other facilities that promised and could actually deliver on the promise of getting them getting individuals inoculated. And there's actually some fines he's actually put in place for that. I do think that those concerns have mostly been resolved because now it's more of a shortage problem, frankly, than a willingness or a delay in administering. Another question that we get a lot that I think is important to understand is the government, both federal and state, and this is a link to a state document, but if you go to this link, there's obviously been questions about how to pay for all of this. This particular document is a circular letter from the Department of Insurance, which is now in New York called the Department of Financial Services. It kind of goes through a little bit, talks about the governor's executive order, and basically concludes that there's really no cost sharing, that it was intended that the administration of immunizations for COVID-19 would be at no charge. For obvious reasons, this is a huge public health crisis that we've had. It's caused an economic crisis, et cetera, and so on. And so this is an attempt to obviously make sure that people get vaccinated and that individuals who couldn't potentially afford are not excluded. So that sort of equalizes the playing field, and everybody should have equal access to the vaccines without worrying so much about having to be able to afford them. So that's very good news for anyone in the state, and most other states and the federal government obviously have similar types of laws and directives in place to kind of address that. Another really significant issue is consent. I've dealt personally with a lot of facilities, so nursing homes, assisted living facilities. Informed consent is important. And even if you're in a medical practice or other type of organization, or just a regular employer that's not necessarily related to healthcare, you have to make sure that the individuals want, they have to consent. Beth's going to talk a lot about mandatory versus permissive vaccination policies. But in any event, you obviously have to make sure the individuals are consenting. And what's useful here is clicking on this hyperlink here to the New York State Department of Health has issued a COVID-19 immunization screening and consent form, as you can see here. It's got a lot of questions, which are useful. It does have a section on consent. And certainly if you've got individuals, for example, that may not have capacity, so you have to rely on a healthcare proxy or some other individual, that those individuals can obviously consent for an individual. So keep in mind, there is a fairly vibrant consent process in place, and there is at least a tool in New York that can be used. I do know that some of the pharmacies and other organizations do have their own consent forms, but I think that this is a kind of one that it looks like a lot of parties are utilizing, and it's fairly comprehensive. So I'm going to pop back in to do a couple more things in a couple minutes, but I want to, so the next topic is mandatory, that we're going to really focus on is mandatory and voluntary vaccination policies, with an obvious slant toward kind of as employers, and it doesn't really matter what kind of employers you are, but kind of how you deal with this. And so I want to turn it over to Beth. We're going to talk about a few issues, and I'm going to kind of slip back in and talk about a couple things in a couple minutes. And then, all three of us, as we're presenting, are going to be in a position to kind of answer questions and also deal with some issues. So I'll turn it over to Beth to talk a little bit about pros and cons.
Thank you, Pat. I appreciate it.
Sure.
So mandatory vaccination programs are nothing new and have been around a long time, particularly in certain industries such as healthcare. The big question here is whether and to what extent will the COVID-19 vaccine be treated differently. And as the vaccine becomes more widely available to the general public, businesses are looking at whether they should make the COVID-19 vaccine mandatory for their workforce or not. And I will tell you, there are going to be headaches associated with either, and you'll just have to weigh it for your own particular business or industry, to figure out what's right for you. I'll tell you, as it stands right now, by and large, employers generally are not leaning towards a mandatory program. They're leaning towards a voluntary program. We'll discuss why as we go through this. But I think the general consensus is, let's try a voluntary program. Let's see if, as a public, we reach that sufficient herd immunity and, hold off on implementing a mandatory program unless we have to. So some of the pros are listed here on this slide. Reduce spread of the virus. What does that mean? That means you have less people, theoretically taking sick leave. We have a new New York paid sick leave law where employees can take paid sick leave. Let's not forget the New York State COVID-19 paid sick leave, which is separate from the other law that fully took effect on January 1st, is still in effect. If somebody has an order of quarantine, they get paid time off. And, in some cases, they can take extended time under New York State disability or paid family leave. Hopefully you'll have less absences if your workforce is vaccinated. Public perception that a fully vaccinated workforce creates a safe place. For service-oriented industries, grocery stores, restaurants, etc., to make people feel safe to come to your establishment, how great would it be to put on your door, we have a fully vaccinated workforce. Reduces fears among staff and customers, like I was just saying. People, will have the mindset they're a little bit safer here, and perhaps your staff will feel safer as well. Minimizes well, there's OSHA risks and other risks. No matter which way you go, we'll talk about it. But if you're not having a COVID outbreak in your workforce, that minimizes, for example, OSHA coming in and saying or the New York State Attorney General coming in and saying you didn't take proper precautions in your workplace. So what are some cons with regard to having a mandatory program in your workforce? The latest statistics I'm reading are as much of as a third of Americans are going to refuse to take the vaccine if it's made available to them. You have to be prepared to enforce that mandatory program across the board, and be prepared that people that would have otherwise applied for a job will not apply. Be prepared for the fact that perhaps some of your key employees or employees in a position that's really hard to recruit for, they're going to leave because they refuse. And you might have vaccinated workers that are upset that they have to work with unvaccinated workers. And then, of course, even if you do have a mandatory program, you will have to make exceptions for people who have a covered disability or medical condition that prevents them from getting the vaccine, or a sincerely held religious belief that in their view stops them from getting a vaccine. You'll have to look at making an accommodation for that. Pre-employment inquiries, and we'll get in more detail about this. So, there are going to be reasons why people can't get a vaccine. And those reasons are oftentimes a covered disability under the ADA. And if you're making a lot of inquiries regarding whether someone can get a vaccine, that's inevitably going to disclose, information regarding somebody's disability or medical condition, and that should be handled with care. So in December, the EEOC released guidance confirming the fact that vaccines may be made eligible. It is officially permissible pursuant to the EEOC. They did reiterate, however, you have to look at whether you make accommodations for somebody's sincerely held religious belief, or for somebody's disability. So looking first at a sincerely held religious belief. What constitutes a sincerely held religious belief? Jurisdictions across the country vary widely on this issue. For example, in Ohio, a vegan brought a claim saying that they shouldn't have to take the flu vaccine because it has egg product in it. And the court held that even though veganism is not technically a religion, it is akin to religion for purposes of determining whether a reasonable accommodation should be made. And an accommodation was made in that instance. Here in New York, there's been cases where somebody does have a sincerely held religious belief, but does not prevent them from getting the vaccine. They just personally feel like they don't want it. There have been cases where people say, I am Catholic or I am a Christian. I just believe that God will take care of me. Therefore, I don't want a vaccine. So in that instance, it's been held, well, you can observe your religion and still get the vaccine just because you're a member of a certain religion, but you don't personally feel like you want to get the vaccine. That would not necessarily be covered. So it really has to be analyzed in close detail as to whether if they say, you know what, my personal religion prevents me from getting this vaccine, you really need to look closely at it to see if it's covered, particularly if you want to institute a mandatory requirement in your workforce. There's also the direct threat, undue hardship. Even if somebody has what would be covered as a sincerely held religious belief, you do the additional analysis of whether allowing that accommodation would pose a direct threat to the workforce. That would be considered sort of an undue hardship under this law. The EEOC has said that COVID-19 can present a direct threat. It would depend, the extent to which that employee deals with the public, and of the public that employee deals with, are they vulnerable? That sort of thing. For a reasonable accommodation analysis under the ADA, what constitutes a covered disability? There's a lot of people anxious about getting this vaccine, or a lot of people have certain reactions generally to this type of vaccine. Are those covered disabilities when when it's more of a sensitivity, whether it's, I'm anxious, I'm a little bit worried about getting this vaccine versus I have a diagnosis of anxiety that prevents me from getting this vaccine. That's a question a lot of employers are going to have to look at and deal with, particularly as the public is nervous, a lot of them, about getting the vaccine. And what is a reasonable accommodation in this context? Is there a direct threat or an undue hardship? You have to look at, again, to what extent is the threat imminent? Does this person deal with the public? Are they in a back office by themselves? In that case, that would suggest possibly wearing a mask, doing the things we've all been doing in our workplace. That would probably constitute a sufficient reasonable accommodation. Or, are you in a nursing home? Are you in a hospital dealing with high-risk people directly all the time? In that case, particularly if you have a mandatory policy, you can exclude those workers from your workforce because they pose a direct threat. So the EEOC guidance, the requirement, again, in and of itself is not a medical examination under the ADA. What does that mean? So if you require medical examinations are heavily regulated under the ADA if you're going to make certain requirements, and that involves somebody getting examined or answering certain questions about their medical condition. Requiring a vaccine is not included in that. However, whether or not you institute a voluntary program or a mandatory program, when you ask employees for proof of the vaccine, which you may do, it's not a disability-related inquiry, make sure that the proof they submit does not also include information about disabilities, their medical condition. Tell them, I only want to see proof that you did receive it, nothing else. Otherwise, some issues can occur with respect to that disclosure.
So Beth,
Yes.
before, and for everybody, before we go into voluntary vaccination policies, I just wanted to mention, and we do have a slide, a couple slides on this too. There is a pending bill in the New York State Legislature that talks about the potential for making the vaccines mandatory in New York. However, it's still in Health Committee. It hasn't passed, and it really only focuses on sort of a future analysis. If in the future there's a determination that the state has failed to achieve sufficient immunity, kind of what everybody's been talking about as herd immunity, there's the potential for that analysis to occur. And if at that point in the future, there's a determination that maybe there is not sufficient immunity, then at that point, the state could consider making the vaccinations mandatory. That is not passed though. That's just a proposed bill. But I wanted to put it sort of at the tail end of our talk on mandatory components, because, you know, again, like Beth said, most practices, most people we've talked to have not really jumped yet to the mandatory vaccination policy, but it's certainly something that even the state is considering. I do think that most everybody is hoping that the voluntary program will be sufficient to achieve the goals of reducing the virus, if not eliminating it, or at least making people not get as sick from it. But I did want to point out that there is the possibility, of course, of mandatory policy if things change a little bit. So that's something for everybody to keep in mind. Not there yet, but something to certainly keep in mind. The state hasn't, and the government really hasn't ruled that out as a possibility. That's going to cause issues. Of course, there'd be exceptions for medical reasons, but that's out there as well.
That's true. The choice may be taken out of our hands as that bill is out there and in discussion, in which case we'll deal with it at that time. You know, in the meantime, voluntary vaccination policy, should you do it? As I mentioned earlier, the general consensus is to not move towards a mandatory program and move to a voluntary program, and hopefully achieve what you want to achieve in terms of safety in the workplace with a voluntary program. How can you do that? First and foremost, if you decide to encourage your employees to get vaccinated, I think a concerted education campaign in your workplace about the vaccine will be key, given the amount of anxiety and uncertainty surrounding the vaccine. As I mentioned earlier, requiring proof of vaccine, make sure that it only provides information regarding the vaccine itself, not any underlying reasons as to why they didn't get a vaccine, for example. Those follow-up questions, you know, can be problematic. They should be handled with care. We're going to be talking a second in about as part of a voluntary program, what type of incentives, if any, do you push to your workforce to encourage them to get vaccinated? If you have a union in your workplace, you should be careful in terms of offering incentives, particularly in the form of bonuses and so forth. The union might object to that, saying it's a unilateral offering of wages regarding a mandatory term of bargaining. They're going to likely insist that you bargain over that incentive. So before you roll out incentives, if you have a union, you want to talk to the union about that first. Just a couple weeks ago, the EEOC issued proposed rules which would really limit employers' ability to offer incentives for a program. Right now, we're reading in the news companies like Trader Joe's, Dollar General, Instacart, other companies, they're offering significant incentives for their workforces to get vaccinated, whether it's additional vacation time, 4 hours of extra pay, these sorts of things. This proposed rule would not go into effect until March and wouldn't be retroactive, which is probably why they're doing it now. There's been no word as to whether the Biden transition team will roll this back or let this go forward as written. If it goes forward as written, employers will not be able to offer anything over and above a quote unquote de minimis incentive. And examples they give of a de minimis incentive would be like a water bottle or a t-shirt or something like that. That will either become final or not by March. It's something to keep an eye on if you're considering offering incentives. And with that, I will turn it over to Langston.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Patrick. So we've talked a lot, Beth and Patrick have, about the vaccine and employer considerations, whether or not a policy is mandatory or it's voluntary. But what I've been hearing from a lot of our clients and a lot of the word on the street is what happens if something goes wrong during the implementation of the vaccine? You know, what liabilities will an employer potentially face, or what liabilities may a pharmacist or any other person that administers the vaccine potentially face? And why is that? What's the concern there? Well, the reality is that what we've been hearing on the news a lot is about the adverse reactions, the potential side effects that a very small population in the community have experienced. Some of the side effects have been minor, and some have been a little more severe. Thankfully, we've not heard of anyone passing away as a result of the vaccine or any adverse reaction to it. But it is a very real concern that kind of fuels the thought by the general public as to whether or not they will, in fact, take the vaccine, or they're going to wait until they see more proof that this isn't going to be long-term detrimental to their health or their family's health. So who is being affected? Well, right now you're talking about the individuals that have been in the first couple of categories of receiving the vaccine. You know, emergency personnel, those that are frontline workers, that are really in the midst of the battle against COVID-19 right now. So you have those employees and others and that fall into those categories that are being vaccinated that are receiving these side effects. So the question is, what is an employer's responsibility to render things like first aid? You know, what must I have on hand in case someone does in fact have an adverse reaction? Am I required to have anything on hand in case someone is experiencing the side effects, whether they be minor or extreme? And maybe a little bit later on, time willing, Patrick can talk about the instances where an employee receives the vaccine, has an adverse reaction, and needs medical care that requires them to be transported to the hospital. Who's responsible for that ambulance cost? These are all questions that are being posed by employers, but the big thing is, what if something goes wrong? What liability do I have at that point in time? And usually, as a litigator, I am the dark cloud that brings bad news to everyone. But in this instance, there is potentially a silver lining to the dark cloud that normally hangs over my head. And that silver lining is called the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. Okay. We're going to talk about the PrEP Act's implications for COVID-19 and the advisory opinion that has come out regarding the PrEP Act. But what is the PrEP Act? Okay. Well, it was enacted in December 30th, on December 30th of 2005. And it authorizes the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services to issue a PrEP Act declaration. The declaration provides immunity from liability, except for willful misconduct, which we'll talk about a little bit later, for claims that surround a loss. And those losses are caused by or arising out of, relating to, or resulting from administration or use of countermeasures to diseases, threats, and conditions determined by the Secretary to constitute a present or credible risk of a future public health emergency. And those declarations are issued to entities and individuals that are involved in instituting approved countermeasures. Now, initially, the PrEP Act was very controversial because those lobbyists and those general people in the community felt it was a windfall for manufacturers of vaccines. It initially just shielded those manufacturers from potential liability for anyone being harmed or injured, even up to death, for any negligence or willful misconduct um, or simple mistakes as a result of creating these vaccines. It was fought, there was a lot of debate, and subsequently it was amended to include a greater number of individuals that were concerned, such as nurses and other medical practitioners. So understanding the PrEP Act during the COVID-19 pandemic. Undersecretary Azar's declaration invoking the PrEP Act during the COVID-19 crisis, liability protections and immunity are available for one, covered persons, two, covered persons engaging in recommended activities, three, covered persons engaging in recommended activities for covered countermeasures. And it is important to understand that the Act requires all three of these things to harmoniously exist together. So those persons and entities who satisfy all three elements are immune from liability for all claims for loss subject to certain limitations. So who is a covered person? A covered person or covered persons, when used with respect to the administration or use of a covered countermeasure, include the United States and any person or entity that is one, a manufacturer of a covered countermeasure, and that includes a contractor or subcontractor of a manufacturer, a supplier or licensor of any product, intellectual property, service, research tool, or component or other article used in the design, development, clinical testing, investigation, or manufacturing of a covered countermeasure, and any or all of the parent company's subsidiaries, affiliates, successors, and assigns of a manufacturer. So as you can see, that's pretty comprehensive. If you are anywhere in the chain of creating, researching, developing a vaccine that is approved, that is an approved covered countermeasure by the government, then you're going to be a covered person under the PrEP Act. Who else are covered persons under the Act? A distributor of a covered countermeasure. That includes a person or entity engaged in the distribution of drugs, biologics, or devices, including but not limited to manufacturers, repackagers, common carriers, contract carriers, air carriers, own label distributors, private label distributors, jobbers, brokers, warehouses, and wholesale drug warehouses, independent wholesale drug traders, and retail pharmacies. Again, that is a pretty comprehensive list of individuals in the actual packing and distribution line of the vaccine that has been created during the manufacturing process. So a lot of you may remember when the vaccine was first getting ready to be shipped out and those first shipments were getting packed. You saw a lot of news footage of the individuals who were packing the vaccine in dry ice containers, getting them sealed and getting ready to go out to the first states that were going to be receiving those vaccine initial doses. All of those individuals that you saw in those news stories, whether they be the packagers, or whether they be the owners of the company, or whether they be along the supervisory chain, fall within the second category under a distributor of a covered countermeasure, including the individual trucking and shipping companies, whether they be by air or land or frankly sea. They are covered persons under the immunity provided by the PrEP Act. Now, where it gets interesting is when you get to prong three, and that's a program planner of a covered countermeasure. Now, those individuals include a state or local government, including an Indian tribe, a person employed by the state or local government, or other person, such as a private sector employer or community group, who supervises or administers a program with respect to the administration, dispensing, distribution, provision, or use of a covered countermeasure. Includes persons who establish requirements or provide policy guidance or who supply technical or scientific advice or assistance, or who provide a facility to administer or use a covered countermeasure in accordance with the applicable declaration. Now, this is really where employers fall into this category, especially in the instances that we're under now, where you have mandatory requirements being put forth by Governor Cuomo that employers, particularly in the healthcare and the skilled nursing facility realm, actually institute or come up with programs for getting their residents as well as their employees vaccinated. There's been a lot of concern and a lot of trepidation over what liability do I have as an employer when I am bringing in a third party pharmacist to actually administer the vaccine, and I control none of that process, but it's going to my employees and those individuals that I'm providing health care for. You know, what liability, if any, do I have? And what the PrEP Act says is that you have no liability so long as there is not willful misconduct. Continuing with a covered person, a qualified person who prescribed, administered, or dispensed a covered countermeasure, or five, an official agent or employee of a person or entity described above. But going back to four, who are those persons that are deemed to have prescribed, administered, or dispensed? Well, that includes licensed health professionals or other individuals who are authorized to prescribe, administer, or dispense covered countermeasures under the law of the state in which the countermeasure was prescribed, administered, or dispensed, or a person within a category identified as qualified in the applicable declaration, such as volunteers. Here, this applies to, in a large sense, to the Walgreens of the world, where they're providing their pharmacists to outside employers or outside of industries to actually go into those industries or employment facilities to administer the vaccine. They are afforded a wide breadth of immunity for anything that goes wrong short of willful misconduct during the implementation of that vaccine. Um, Now, the interesting thing here is it talks about volunteers. What we've heard from the Biden administration in the last 48 hours is the desire to implement um, a large scale number of vaccine facilities, particularly in some of the underserved communities that have been hardest hit by COVID-19. And they talked about getting a volunteer force trained to be able to administer the vaccine. Well, once you go through that training and you are now acting under the guise and auspices of the federal government, you are now covered by the PrEP Act and are afforded a large breadth of immunity like the other individuals described under the PrEP Act. Um, so now we've talked about covered persons and we've talked about the countermeasures, but what are the recommended activities? Well, those activities include the manufacture, testing, development, distribution, administration, and use of covered countermeasures. And the April 14th opinion clarifies that to qualify for immunity, recommended activities must be related to any arrangement with the federal government, as we just discussed, any activity that is part of an authorized emergency response at the federal, regional, state, or local level, and any activity that can be authorized by guidance requests for assistance, agreements, or other arrangements because of the Health and Human Services Secretary's COVID-19 Public Health Emergency Declaration. Those all constitute emergency responses that are authorized under the PrEP Act, and the immunity will apply. So the Secretary's declaration defines covered countermeasures as any product used to treat, diagnose, cure, prevent, or mitigate COVID-19 or other transmissions of SARS, CoV-2, or a virus mutating therefrom, or any device used in the administration of any such product, and all components and constituent materials of any such product. That seems pretty self-explanatory, but basically anything that is used to implement the program is going to be covered under this. The April 14th opinion clarifies that a covered countermeasure is a drug, device, or biological product, must be used by used for COVID-19, and must be approved, licensed, or cleared by the FDA. It's authorized under the emergency use authorization. It's described in the emergency use instructions issued by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or used under either an investigational new drug application or investigational device exemption. So what are the limitations on immunity under the PrEP Act? The scope of the immunity, as we discussed, is broad, but it's not absolute. Liability protections will not fall to those individuals that are willful in their misconduct. And to do so, they have to go through a 3-panel judge determination in DC to determine whether or not there is immunity and whether or not they were acting under the PrEP Act. Included in the slides, which you will all receive, are a discussion on some of those limitations that have been tested. And I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit because we're short on time. I want to make sure that we stay under the time limits. But you have a case, Parker versus St. Lawrence County, which is very interesting, where the court ultimately held that a school district's implementation of a vaccine program fell under the protections under the PrEP Act, as well as Keeler versus Hood, which talks about a county's immunity under the PrEP Act. But as we talked about earlier, there are some other things that should be considered before implementing a program or before following through with your program. And I just want to have Beth and Pat come back in and talk about some of those other things that should be considered prior to instituting a program.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that ultimately, as Langston said, it's going to depend a little bit on which type of entity you are, or what type of facility you are. So for example, I mentioned a little bit earlier about nursing facilities. They're obviously focused a lot on having pharmacies come in. And pharmacies, they're having a 3-step clinic process where there'll be the initial inoculation, then 21 days later, approximately, there'll be the second. And then at that second clinic date, there potentially will be not just the individuals who are receiving their second doses, but new individuals that weren't available for the first time. And then there'll be a third clinic date, 21 days later after that. And then at that point, my understanding is that some of the pharmacies won't actually be involved directly. They won't be going back to the nursing facilities or the assisted living facilities. So that's just kind of one area where there's a lot of, as Langston said, a lot of liability issues with respect to the pharmacies, and how would that interact with those facilities? Will the facilities be responsible because they're not really doing the administration, they're just arranging for the administration? Same thing with you as employers, putting aside a specific healthcare or other type of entity. If you, each year, a lot of employers, our office included, often has a flu clinic. So individuals will come from outside. They will be made available by us as an employer, but we're not really administering the flu vaccines. We're not really involved in getting the consent. We're not involved in a lot of the processes. So the real question is, who is responsible? Would there be, if something goes wrong and one of your employees has an adverse reaction, is that covered by workers' comp? Something that Beth can talk a bit about. Is it not covered by workers' comp? Would the employer be responsible? Would the outside flu clinic be responsible? Would they all be responsible? Would the owner of the building, if we're renting from the building, and who's responsible? These are all things that occasionally will be questions, and certainly they've been questions in the past with respect to flu vaccines generally. With COVID, there hasn't been much experience yet with any of these things. So it is a bit of an open area, but there are things to consider. A lot of practices I've talked to, a lot of employers that I've talked to, have erred on the side of wanting to stay out of the actual administration of the vaccines for just these very reasons. They're concerned about liability. Certainly, anytime you're concerned about liability, you always want to check with your insurance carrier to see what their position is. You may have a policy that covers that. You may not have a policy that covers things. So those are all considerations that I think need to be looked at on your individual levels, depending on kind of where things stand. And again, you know, as the last bullet point here notes, with respect to vaccine shortages, I really think that that's an important consideration. Even if you want to make have a clinic come to your place of employment for your staff, what if you can't deliver? What if the clinic can't deliver? So you do definitely have to have backup, backup policies and procedures in place to kind of address all of those issues. So, and the law is obviously evolving. As I mentioned when I started, and I drafted some of the initial slides a couple of days ago, and already they're modified. You know, with the new administration this week, as Langston said, there've already been a lot of new things that have been out there. A lot of interesting things, even on testing beyond, even beyond just the administration of the vaccine. There's been a lot of issues on testing. I don't know if Beth, you want to add anything? I have some other things, some questions that we want to get to in the last 9 or 10 minutes here. But I don't know if you wanted to add anything like on a workers' comp basis.
So, yeah. Whether you decide to have vaccines on-site or off-site, there are considerations with both. If you have it on-site, you have to consider if there is a severe adverse reaction, will there be a workers' compensation claim there? I would encourage you to speak with your carrier about that before you make that decision. And also, if you have it on site, there are pre-screening questions that go with the vaccine, which will inevitably elicit ADA covered information. That's something you have to look at. If you send employees off-site, if you have a mandatory program, that's compensable time. You'll have to pay them for that time and that sort of thing. So there are those considerations that you're going to want to walk through, whether you have it on-site or off-site. And just briefly, because I think it's important and it may not be obvious, is, people are going to have a lot of opinions about vaccines, regardless on the position that you take. And they're going to be talking about it. And those communications will likely be covered as protected speech under the National Labor Relations Act and under the OSHA whistleblower provisions with regard to the safety of your working conditions. So before you, fire somebody or discipline somebody for espousing their opinions regarding the vaccine, you need to look at whether, there are liabilities under those laws. OSHA has said that if somebody refuses to take the vaccine because they believe it will cause them serious harm, and something happens to them as a result, whether they're disciplined or terminated, that could be considered whistleblower activity. So just a couple of other extra considerations to think about. And with that, we can turn it over to questions.
Yeah, I want to start off. There is a question that I want to actually direct for Langston to answer, but I was also hoping, Leah, if you could give me back control of the slides. I want to go to one other slide. There's a second question that I want to answer with respect to the slides. But Langston, there's a question that has come in about if there are any age restrictions or recommendations with respect to the vaccines. I know there's been a lot of talk about that. I thought maybe you could field that question while I go to this other slide in a minute.
That's actually a very good question, especially considering the fact that there is a huge push to get children back into school on a full-time, everyday basis with in-person learning. There's concerns with teachers, by the teachers and teachers unions about whether or not that subjects them to additional risk. Right now, the CDC's recommendation is that children 16 and older should be vaccinated, but not younger. Now that does not mean that eventually there will not be a vaccination recommendation for those younger. I know currently there are several individual companies that are signing up children 12 and under for programs, testing programs. But as the current recommendation goes, it is for those age 16 years and older to be vaccinated.
Thank you. So another question that I'd received was, I had talked a little while ago about the mandatory vaccination requirement that potentially could be passed in New York. I wanted to just give everybody, somebody asked in one of the questions about the actual bill number. Here's the slide with the detail there. It's pending New York Bill Assembly, that's what the A stands for, 11179. And if you go to, there is a site. If anyone's interested or wants more information, certainly you can email me offline. There is a site that you can go to and plug in that bill number, and it will bring up the legislative history, a little bit of that. It's been in committee, like I mentioned. It may or may not progress. I do think it's going to depend again on the status of how many people get it, whether there's immunity. Obviously from what everybody has been talking about, kind of somebody else asked a little bit of question too about variants. Obviously, there's variants have been detected in South Africa, in the UK. The real question, and I know Dr. Fauci on a national level had answered this yesterday, whether or not the vaccines are going to protect against the new variants. I think that's an open question. Obviously, we're not medical doctors, so we don't want to espouse too much on medical things. But I do think that ultimately there are still open questions. There's open questions about if you get COVID naturally, how long that natural immunity may last versus the vaccine immunity, and then the variants. There is, obviously a question medically about whether or not the vaccine will protect against the variants or not. I heard yesterday that it's possible that by early March, the variant may become the prevalent strand of the virus in the United States if it continues on the path it's going. So, those are things that shouldn't be too concerned about yet, because I still think there's some evidence from the medical professionals that are articulating it that there is protection. That is, even if it's not as great, that even the current vaccines have protection against the variants to some level, maybe not as effective, but my understanding is that even if ultimately that becomes a problem, there are ways to modify the current vaccine. Again, right now, the key issue and the most important one is distribution. And I know distribution is going to be ramped up.
Yeah, if we could answer another question.
Yeah, please.
Before we run out of time.
Please go ahead.
There have been two questions. One, vaccine is authorized EUA only, can't be mandatory to receive it. So the emergency use authorization basically got rid of the red tape that a vaccine would ordinarily go through to be made available to the public, because we're in the midst of a public health crisis. It has nothing to do with whether it can be made mandatory. The government has said it is optional right now at the business level to make it mandatory. The New York State, I'm sure other states are considering a mandatory measure if necessary. But even though it's the authorization is for emergency use, it can be made mandatory. We had another question. Well, what about naturally acquired immunity? It's been shown to be as good as the COVID. Couple of things. There are some in the science community that would say this virus is constantly changing every day, and so your immunity acquired for the strain that you got a few months ago might not be as good now. Whether you would want to say I shouldn't have to get the vaccine because of that, that would depend on whether your employer would want to make an exception for that, whether you can get a medical provider to vouch that you don't in fact need the vaccine because you've already had COVID.
I'd just like to add, I think we should, everybody should keep in mind, keeping an eye on this bill that's pending in the Assembly, because as Dr. Fauci said as recently as this morning, what everybody wants to get back to is some normalcy. And in order to get there, we need 70 to 85% of the population to be vaccinated. But there is a strong belief that once we hit about 50 to 60% of vaccinating the population, that's where you're going to hit that real resistance to by those who do not want to be vaccinated, whether it is by some medical reason, a religious reason, or a fear, or simply they just don't want to. That's where getting that next 10 to 25% of vaccinating the population is going to be tough, but you're not going to get back to normalcy until you can get to those numbers. So you may at that point in time see bills like the current bill in the Assembly being revisited to force the country to get to that vaccination population.
Absolutely. And one other question, if we didn't get to your question, by the way, obviously after the presentation, feel free to email any of us and we'd be happy to follow up if if that makes some sense. There's a question of what's the most important legal issue we should make a priority. I don't know if Langston, you or Beth want to quickly answer that. It's right at our cutoff time, but I think we could probably answer another 30 seconds.
Beth,
So
you
from
take
my
that?
point of view, if, unless you're in the nursing home industry and they've already, had to directly deal with this, I think you as a business, you need to figure out what your position, and it could be no position, but you have to figure out what that position is. Are we going to encourage and incentivize it and push a voluntary vaccination campaign? Are we going to push a mandatory vaccination campaign and talk to your lawyer, your insurance carriers, et cetera, about liabilities? Decide what your approach and communications are going to be. I think that's the most important thing to do right now.
Well, thank you, everybody. On behalf of Polano and Farrow, we really appreciate your time. And again, follow up if you have any questions. We will be following up with the PowerPoint presentation. We may also, we have to figure it out, but we may actually just have a recording of this also available in the future as well, if anyone is interested. And we hope to do more of these in the future. So certainly, if there's any feedback, feel free to provide it to us, and we're happy to help. Thanks again. Have a great afternoon and weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.